World War II saw mass food shortages for millions of people in involved areas, but what did this look like country to country? Here are just a few examples of the countries that suffered from rationing. I've left links down below of some of the websites I used to research this video if you wanted to do any extra research of your own. In 1939, only 30% of British food was being produced in Britain. This meant that when boats were getting requisitioned for war usage, England had significantly less imports coming in. The government became very involved in the nation's food intake in order to prevent a famine. They started the Dig for Victory and Make Do and Make Mend campaigns. And by 1943, there was 1.5 million allotments producing around 1 million tonnes of vegetables. Despite this, foods that weren't produced using this method still had to be rationed, such as meat and fatty foods. All citizens were given a rationing book full of coupons that they could use to take out portions of their rations. The list of foods increased throughout the war as Germans sank more trade ships. An example of a ration for an adult during the war was 4 ounces of bacon and ham, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of cheese, 4 ounces of margarine, 4 ounces of cooking fat, 3 pints of milk, 8 ounces of sugar, 1 pound of jam every 2 months, 2 ounces of tea, and 1 egg a week. Because children were still growing, they had an increased ration of milk and orange juice to sustain that. Many non-food items were also rationed, such as clothing, petrol, and paper. Bread was rationed until 1948, but foods like tea, eggs, and sugar were rationed until the 1950s. During this time, a black market of rationed goods popped up, supplying people with things like makeup, cigarettes, and petrol. Despite the government's best efforts, crime rates increased drastically throughout the war. Some criminals even used the Blitz to hide their illegal activities, as it was a lot easier to trade illicit goods in the darkness. These gained huge profits and the government could do little to stop it. Although Germany didn't have an official rationing system, the country did face scarcity and starvation during the war. In the lead up to the war, the Nazis attempted to become self-sufficient in food production in order to avoid the hardships of the First World War when the enemies blockaded their trade routes. In typical Nazi fashion, this was done through propaganda, telling people to change their eating habits to accommodate to the shortages. As the war came closer, the regime targeted housewives, telling them to make nutritious meals with the scarce ingredients available. The difference in class really shone through at this time, as the rich continued to buy whatever they wanted, and the poor had to suffer with the scraps they left behind. The top Nazi officials were the worst offenders of this. Goering, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, would go out to fancy restaurants and would eat more than a single person's weekly ration in just one meal. As the rations became more and more implemented, they hit some more than others. Unsurprisingly, the Jews, foreign workers and prisoners suffered from harsh cuts to their rations. By the winter of 1941, farmers were struggling to keep up with the demand of food. While grain harvests were maintained until 1943, meat and fat rations were cut in 1942, and then reduced more the following year. As you would probably expect, the rations in Nazi concentration camps were very horrific. At Auschwitz, the prisoners were given a bowl of watery soup and scraps of root vegetables at lunch, then a small bread ration at dinner. This led to mass starvation, but the Nazis were very happy to let this go on if their workers and soldiers were getting well fed. As the war went on, Goering suggested that the hunger should be exported out of Germany. This was a contributing factor to the decision to invade the Soviet Union. Between 1941 and 1943, millions of tons of food were getting exported out of the Soviet Union. However, this new food shortage meant the deaths of 1 million Soviet prisoners. Millions of civilians were being deprived of food, and tens of thousands of Jews starved to death. The newly acquired food didn't last very long, however, as by 1944, the situation was worse than before. The black market flourished at this point, with housewives trading non-perishable foods like soap for food just to keep their families going. Even shop owners were getting desperate. There are accounts of angry customers complaining about shopkeepers selling their stock to friends and family without leaving any for customers. Overall, the Nazi policies did very little to satisfy their citizens and led to the starvation of millions of Jews, Soviets, and prisoners, along with plenty of their own residents. After the German invasion of France, they implemented a brutal rationing system on their citizens. This was in order to profit from the French economy to fund the war still raging in Europe. The typical ration for an adult was 350 grams of bread a day, 50 grams of cheese and 300 grams of meat a week, 50 grams of rice, 250 grams of pasta, 200 grams of margarine and 250 grams of sugar a month. This would have provided about 1,300 calories a day, which isn't even enough to sustain someone just laying about all the time, let alone someone working. Everyone had a ration book, but due to the lack of personnel, this distribution took a long time, often queuing for 5 hours just to get the tickets, and then another excruciating wait outside of the butchers or bakers to actually get their rations. By 1941, they had finally figured out the rationing system, but at this point the shops had little to sell the civilians. By 1942, rations for the French decreased by 12%, and the quota for exports to Germany increased. Even the German authorities in Paris thought that this would lead to mass starvation and the complete collapse of the French economy. Germany had decided that they wanted the French to pay back the invasion costs that it took for them to occupy France. This added up to about 2 million Reichsmark a day. On top of this, they also changed the exchange rate from 1 Reichsmark to 2 francs, so that the Germans could pay for French goods cheaply to export back to Germany. At the same time, the black market in Paris thrived, selling rationed goods and the rationing booklets, despite the Germans trying to change the colour every month. The biggest and most influential gang that sprang up at the time were the Bonnets Lafont, headed by Henry Lafont. They dominated the black market, trading goods and foods across Paris. In 1942, they went from just being a crime group to being aligned with the Gestapo, becoming even more powerful and dangerous. The business grew from black market trading to hunting down Jews and resistance members. While the rest of Paris starved, Lafont was living in luxury, showing what the severe rations did to the crime landscape of Paris. The French Gestapo's reign of terror might not have been as significant without the Bonnets Lafont's influence. From the beginning of the Nazi occupation of Poland, food was forcefully confiscated from the Polish people for the benefit of the Germans. By 1941, the German population in Poland was getting around 2,600 calories a day, while the Poles received around 700 and the Jews in the ghettos received about 180. Before the war, the agricultural production in the now Nazi-occupied central zone of Poland, called the General Government, was already not self-sufficient and relied on other areas of Poland for food. Despite this, Germany confiscated 27% of agricultural outputs from this region, creating a humanitarian crisis. Up to 25% of Poles in urban areas relied on outside aid to survive. This became worse when the Nazis annexed eastern areas of Poland, which had been occupied by the USSR, sending 1 million more citizens into the General Government. Like most other countries, Poland relied on the black market to not starve to death. It's estimated that 80% of Poles relied on the black market to survive during the war. Despite the Germans keeping up large police forces to eliminate the black market, dealers persisted, even at the threat of arrest, deportation, or being sent to a concentration camp. This occupation was brutal, with around 27,000 Poles perishing from the living conditions put on them by the Nazis. On the lighter note, even though the US was far from the fighting in Europe, it still had to ration some of its foods, with a lot of their canned and processed foods being shipped overseas to their allies. Due to this, the US also had rationing books, restricting sugar, meat, cooking oil and canned goods. This was obviously not as severe as those in the occupied countries. I don't think anyone died because they couldn't have a can of beans. However, where their rationing was really implemented was with their materials. Tyres, which were imported from Asia, were the first to be rationed, followed by oil, which was needed for the war effort. Factories were converted from producing domestic items to military equipment, which increased the price of everyday items. Wool was needed for army uniforms and parachutes, which meant clothes were more costly, so the public was advised to make do with what they already had. Eventually, a new act was put in place which increased the amount of Americans paying income tax, which would have paid for the war effort. While the Americans didn't starve, they still had to make sacrifices to aid their allies in Europe. Rationing had been implemented throughout the war, but with the invasion of the Nazis in 1941, the situation became more desperate, with cities coming under siege with no hope of reinforcements. Over 1 million Russians starved during World War II and the post-war period. The siege of Petrograd was the most brutal, starting on the 8th of September and lasting for 872 days. Thousands of people perished from starvation and an estimated 800,000 people were killed. This is close to the total deaths of the UK and the US combined. Despite the starvation, cannibalism was actually very rare. What was more common was murder for people's rationing cards. In 1942, there was 1,216 cases of murder of this kind, with a total of around 100,000 people starving each month. In non-occupied areas, there was a very complicated system of rationing, as the government was more concerned with stopping the Nazis killing millions of their citizens. Their rations included bread, flour, meat, sugar and fish. This food was distributed in accordance with a person's influence on the war effort. So someone working in a factory would gain more than someone working in an office. However, the difference was very severe, with the less important people not even being able to access meat or fish. This meant they would often trade with soldiers for the food in exchange for clothes. Eventually, the US was able to send support through the Lend-Lease agreement. However, the food shortages and Nazi destruction of land would have detrimental impacts over the next few years. The first resource to be rationed in Ireland was oil, which hit the production of factories hard. In addition, home fires were banned and electricity was restricted to put limits on the amount of general use fuels. Ireland relied heavily on imports of English oil, but over the war, England needed this oil to fuel their ships, tanks, and factories. The rationing of tea, sugar, butter, and clothes sparked protests across Ireland as domestic trade reduced. On top of this, a harsh winter in 1942 destroyed a lot of the wheat harvests, meaning that bread also had to be rationed, causing further outrage. Meat and eggs were some of the things not rationed at the time, but people in the cities found it harder to get a hold of them than those in rural areas. There became more of a reliance on locally produced goods, so those in rural communities fared a lot better than those in urban cities. Despite these rations, the Irish found ways to get around them, using turf as an alternate fuel source for trains and using older agricultural methods to keep up with the production. Unlike most nations in the war, Ireland's agricultural production actually increased rather than decreased. While it's easy to say that one country had it a lot easier than the others, let's just appreciate what we have right now and that we aren't living in extreme war times. If you did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, as it really does help out my channel a lot, and leave a comment down below of what you want me to cover next.